Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my past week in reading. This past weekend I was doing some traveling. I went up to New York City. It was my niece's 13th birthday, so we decided we'd take her doing some sightseeing, force her to see an opera, some stuff like that. So the first thing that I read before we left was the newest trade of Hellblazer. This is The Smokeless Fire. This was written by Simon Oliver and drawn by 4 different artists, each of whom has a fairly distinct style, which ended up not being terribly cohesive. The first art style I quite liked. As it continued on, it moved to a much more cartoony style, which I didn't think fit the overall mood. And then finally it has a more, I guess you'd call it, traditional superhero style at the end. Wasn't such a fan of any of those, although I did quite like the covers. Story-wise, this has John Constantine going after a djinn. There's nothing wrong with it, but there are a lot of stories about djinns, about genies, and about magic. And for a Hellblazer story, you expect something uncomfortable to happen, and nothing uncomfortable happened. The story was fine, but there was nothing particularly interesting or entertaining about it. And because the art styles were never cohesive and didn't really mesh together, I was not particularly a fan of this. I do quite like the cover, but this was disappointing overall. So next up, I read Border by Kapka Kassabova. The subheading on this is A Journey to the Edge of Europe. The author is originally from Bulgaria. Her family moved to New Zealand in the early 90s when she was in her late teens. Currently lives in Scotland. She has written a memoir about growing up in Bulgaria. This book in particular looks at the border between Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey, and how that border area has evolved primarily since the 1980s, but also looking back since the 1920s and the population exchanges. So she goes through the discussions of people, primarily Germans, who were shot trying to cross the border from Bulgaria into Turkey during the Cold War. She looks at Syrian refugees in the modern day who have gotten into Turkey and are trying to cross over into either Greece or Bulgaria. She looks at the descendants of people who were from border regions who were forced across borders, so Bulgarian speakers who had been living in Greece prior to 1923 who were forced to cross into Bulgaria, and the Greeks who crossed from Turkey and Bulgaria into Greece, and the ethnic Turks who were forced to go to Turkey from Greece, and then again, and not just in the 1920s, but looking at the expulsions that happened from Bulgaria even in the 1980s. And I think the Turkish population there was at some point 10% of the population. And I mean, these were people who had been there since the 1400s, or actually even prior to Ottoman times. So in each country, she is talking to people who can point across the border and say, that was where my grandparents lived. So it's an interesting look at that, at population flow and the politics of language and ethnicity and religion, and how that affected those historical movements. And then, again, a look at the politics of the point when Bulgaria was a Warsaw Pact country and now it's an EU country, and who can move across borders to visit their grandparents or now great-grandparents' houses in those other countries and who cannot. And it was a really interesting look at all of those things on a personal level. On a broader level, I think the one complaint that I would have is a lot of times the author obviously speaks Bulgarian, but she doesn't speak Greek or Turkish. So often when she's talking to people, she's counting on a friend of hers to do the translating for her. And at one point, there's a Bulgarian guy who's translating Greek for her, and at a later point, there's a Greek woman who speaks English who says to her, that guy's Greek is terrible. So who knows how good his translations are. At another point, she's talking to a couple in Turkey who are originally from Bulgaria and who as children were forced to move to Turkey in the 1980s. And the wife doesn't speak Bulgarian anymore, although she understands it, and the husband does. So the husband is translating for his wife. And in that kind of situation, you almost wonder if he's giving a perfect translation or not, because this isn't somebody who's unbiased. So I did wonder at points like that how good the translations were. But still, overall, this was a brilliant read. And it's a really interesting look at borders and politics and the personal level, because I think people in other regions might have really nationalistic ideas about what it means to be Greek or Turkish or Bulgarian. The rest of the world has a notion of the Balkans, which I think we often talk about in terms of just the former Yugoslavia, but even the whole area in a very kind of cynical way, and I think it was nice to read something that puts a more human face on all of those things. And it really points out the commonalities between the people in these three countries and what they and their families have experienced over time with these shifting powers. Next up, I switched over to comics again and read Volume 1 of The Woods, which is called The Arrow. This is written by James Tynion IV and was drawn by Michael Dialynas. This is a kind of science fiction fantasy comic about a group of teenagers whose high school is transported to another world. This is a collection of the first 4 issues of an ongoing series. It is all right, I would say. The story doesn't have a lot of setup, which I think is maybe standard for an ongoing series, but reading it as a collected volume, I felt a little unsatisfied with it. I would like to have had more build-up before they shift to the other world. It was fine. The art was fine. It wasn't particularly special. My library does have all of the collected volumes on Hoopla, so I may read the rest of it, but it's definitely not a series I would be picking up if I had to pay for it. After that, I started reading a memoir called Keeper. This is by Andrea Gillies. The subheading on this one is One House, 3 Generations, and a Journey into Alzheimer's. This is about a woman in Scotland whose family was both starting a bed and breakfast and bringing in her in-laws to live with her. Her father-in-law had fairly significant mobility impairments, and her mother-in-law was at that point in the middle stages of Alzheimer's. And over the course of a few years, her mother-in-law's condition degrades even more, to a point where her mother-in-law is both verbally and physically abusing her children, which is a little appalling. The book is definitely very honest. The author is not pulling any punches. She is incredibly frustrated, and it's interesting that she's the one who's acting as the primary caregiver when these are not her parents. These are her husband's parents. And this mother-in-law treats her very poorly, but at the same time, it's perhaps not her fault because she has Alzheimer's. And the author goes through a lot of research. She's doing a lot of reading at the same time, and she presents research. And as her mother's condition degrades, she talks about what parts of the brain are presumably causing her to behave in X way, Y way, Z way, etc. Which I guess is a way that let her keep dealing with it because she could think about it that way. And I think that makes this an interesting read because it has both the very personal account of what was happening and also the research that she was doing that looks at what causes what. The issue that I had with some of the research is that having come off reading a bulk of neuroscience-related material earlier this month, there were a few points in here where I recognized studies that she was referring to, and I don't think she presented them with exactly the framework that they would normally be presented in, so I thought some of that might have been a bit misleading. But at the same time, she has such a solid reference section that if any of those particular things interested you, you would be able to go back and do the same research that she did and maybe note where the framing would be different. I was very impressed with this. It was one of those points where there were often points where I was shocked that they kept the parents in the house past this point where her mother-in-law is hitting the grandchildren, the author's children. It was really interesting to look at the social services side of things where basically once they said to social workers that they couldn't handle these parents anymore, then right away they were bumped up the list to get them into care. But before that, they couldn't even get these parents on the waiting list, even though at one point they were talking about a cognitive test that a doctor would come in and perform, and if they scored under 25, that meant that the person had a significant cognitive impairment. And the mother-in-law scores a 2 at one point, so she's clearly much more impaired than a lot of people who would have already gone into care. But because they hadn't said the right words to the social worker, they weren't able to get on the list. So that part was also very interesting. There are these 3 distinct pieces about the social services piece, the family memoir piece, and the neuroscience piece. So definitely an interesting read. After that, I went back to another comic and read Justice League of America Volume 2, The Curse of the Kingbutcher. This I thought was somewhat better than Volume 1. It is a standard Tarzan-esque story with someone who was raised in the wilds and it turns out to be from a wealthy family, and it's that story. It is, as with a lot of the comics that I was reading this past week, not bad, but not particularly great either. This is, again, another series that, because my library has it on Hoopla, I will keep reading it, but if I were paying for this, I would drop it very quickly. After that, flipped back to the nonfiction and read The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. The subheading on this one is The Dark Story of America's Shining Women. This is about two luminescent watch factories, one in New Jersey that was founded during the First World War, and one in small town Illinois that was founded in the 1920s, where these workers were painting radium-laced paint, and all of them ended up with radiation poisoning. Going into this, I had expected this to have more of a medical focus. I was expecting this to be a portrait of these women going through the various stages of radiation poisoning. And while there is a little bit of that, the actual focus is on the two legal battles that they were fighting, to have it recognized that this radiation sickness and the radiation poisoning was an effect of the work that they were doing, where they're putting these paintbrushes in their mouths, and it's just appalling, which was definitely very interesting and was historically important because that obviously set safety standards that exist to this day. Although in the afterward, we learn that almost exactly the same thing happened in exactly the same small town in Illinois in the 1970s, which I think was even more appalling. Because even though you think, okay, people knew that radiation poisoning was a thing in 1901, you can kind of imagine what the average level of education was in 1917 or 1920. You gotta go, okay, I can understand why they didn't realize how risky that was, but to see that in the late 70s is even more appalling, and that was just a side note at the very end. In any case, even though this wasn't the medical overview that I was expecting, I found this incredibly compelling, and I read this literally in one sitting. It was very depressing because you do, even though I said it's not a medical focus, you do read about these women basically disintegrating from the inside. But it was definitely a very interesting portrait of the time, and portrait of the legal system, and a very light commentary on abuses of capitalism. And since that was very serious, I followed that up by reading something that would be a little more fluffy and charming, and I read Volume 1 of the Backstagers, which I have seen a lot of people on BookTube talk about. This is a comic series that is also written by James Tynion IV, but unlike The Woods, which I talked about earlier, this is really charming. This is another story about teenagers who are able to move from their high school into another world, but in a less gritty way. This is fluff. This is about people in theater. This is not what I would call normally my thing, but I was completely charmed by it. It was adorable. The art style is highly cartoony, but given the kind of story that this is, it fit perfectly. It's definitely not a serious and gritty plot. This is silly and cute, and I definitely think that this is one of those books that people who don't read comics but who do like a certain kind of teenage fluff kind of story, I think that would have a lot of crossover appeal because, yeah, it was a charming little book. So that was my week. Apparently it was equal parts depressing nonfiction and mostly mediocre comic books. In any case, I hope you've had a good reading week, and if you're in the US, I hope you had a good long weekend. And that's it for now. Ciao.